Hello students, well we're going to start a new unit. We're going to be in chapter 27 now, and we're going to talk about post-war prosperity. So we're going to be looking at the United States after World War II, look at some of the economics and some of the societal issues that were going on during that time frame. So we're going to first talk about the economics. So we're in 27.1. So we're going to really focus in today on the economic activity of the United States. So one of the things we first want to look after is how is the American economy coming off of World War II? Well, it's doing quite well, actually. The United States goes through one of the greatest growth that we've ever seen economically. Our GDP grows through the roof, people are employed in more numbers than ever, and most people are bringing home enough money that they're living a comfortable middle-class lifestyle where they can actually have one job pay for everything that is needed at home. So this is where you really see the rise of the homemaker. You'll see that usually displayed on older television shows or movies where mom stays at home all day, cooks the turkey, waiting for the man to come home and have his meal. Was it the same in every home? No, but that was like the ideal American home during this time. One of the big things to understand of how booming the economy was is that Americans made up 6% of the world's population, yet during this time they consume over 50% of the manufactured goods in the world. So there is massive consumption going on because our economy is so strong. And there's a number of factors that drives this ability to purchase. Aside from having good jobs, there's a few other elements that give them that ability. Now you say, what's the difference though between the United States and the Soviet Union? Why does America have such a great economy comparatively? Well, there's a couple factors. First and foremost, the United States wasn't industrially impacted by the war. So say, for example, bombing of cities did not occur in the United States. Remember, Stalingrad was an industrialized center of the Soviet Union, completely and absolutely obliterated during the Battle of Stalingrad. So the Soviet Union had to pull itself back up from basically ruin. Secondly, communist controls over the economic system also, albeit a highly industrialized society as it goes along, does not follow like the demand methods of capitalistic economies where you have a certain amount of supply, you have a certain amount of demand, and you meet those needs. And that's what drives American business and innovation, whereas the Soviets is a very controlled economic system where the government usually dictates what is being produced and what is needed comparative to the consumer demanding those items. What was going on in Europe? Well, Europe's kind of in the same situation as the Soviet Union. Their economy is completely and absolutely destroyed after World War II. So they are also not able to compete economically with the United States. In fact, they're buying a lot of the products from America. And so this really drives the American economy to a very high and rapid pace. And it continues on for quite some time, this explosive growth. I mean, there are moments where there's brief recessions, but nothing quite like what you would ever see with the Great Depression or anything else like this during these economic activities. All right, so let's talk about 7 factors. Remember, we've discussed this before, 7 factors. This time we're going to talk 7 factors of the economy. And these are going to be broken down, of course, into the following. So if you guys need to take notes, here's your notes really quickly. We're going to talk about demand. We're going to talk about transportation, equipment and tools, natural resources, labor, money and credit, and profit. So we're going to go through those different aspects, okay? So let's first focus off demand. That's one of the biggest things here, okay? During World War II, there is mass rationing. And when you look at it itself, rationing is done to an extreme level where you were trying to recycle every element of aluminum and steel. They would ask you for that, to limitations on what you could purchase from a consumer end, from food items to even gasoline for your car. In some cases, you could only buy like 3 gallons within a certain time frame. So Americans were not highly mobile. They were highly restricted, and this allowed, so think about this, you have a man deployed, you have a woman at home working in a factory, and neither one of them can really buy anything. Consumer goods are very rare. They're expensive too. So if you can't go out and buy it and you can't afford it, you're just going to bank all that money. And that's what a lot of these women and men were doing, especially the soldiers. You know, they didn't have a lot of means to spend it, so they saved a lot of their money. So when they came home, they had fair amounts of savings ready for them to be able to spend when they hit here. And once they leave the war and they have access to goods and services, and their wives have access to goods and services, they start to buy in mass. One of the very first things that they start to buy are homes. You see millions upon millions of homes spring up. And this is a change because what it does is it pushes the Americans from the city or even the kind of outer rings of the city into what we know as the suburbs. And so you see a mass movement of middle class population out of there. Now there are a number of terminologies that are used for this exodus of people. There's a lot of research that has been done on this, so if you are at all interested, as I always say, try to build your own worldview. Go out and find some of those articles if you're really interested in exodus of middle class working Americans from the inner city. Also, we have the baby boom during this time. And yes, this is where that term boomer comes from, is from the baby boom. Parents come home, they have a lot of money, they have the means and the ability to support a large family, so they have lots and lots of children. Often you have families up to 5 to 7 kids. So there's rapid population growth during this time frame. And also, life expectancy has vastly improved too, because medical technology is really caught up at this point in time. So you see a large growth, and you see a lot of children where historically children would have a hard time surviving past the age of 5 and very rarely sometimes get to the age of 18. You see a family growth that is unprecedented during this time. All right. Now, one thing that does come with living in the suburbs is that now you are further away from work. Because you're further away from work, guess what you need? Transportation. And not only do you need transportation, but guess what? You're going to leave wife at home. And the wife's going to need a car too, so she can go shopping. So she can buy everything she needs to make you your dinner when you get home. Kind of that ideology. Now, because of this, this drives a mass consumerism of automobiles. You oftentimes see families with 2 or 3 automobiles at home. And this drives the automotive industry. It makes tremendous amounts of money for the auto industry. But it also really drives the American expanded way of the open road, of how they like to travel and move around by vehicle and have their independence. So the automobile is really a sign of independence within the American structure. That's why a lot of Americans are very big on owning a car instead of relying upon mass transportation. If you can have the means, the ability to own a car, you're usually going to own a car. That's kind of the nuts and bolts of the situation. Also, we're not just talking about cars, we're talking about innovations that have occurred during this time frame that drive consumer spending. You see a whole host of new products and services available to the average everyday American that makes their lives easier and more convenient. This is everything from vacuums to washing machines to refrigerators and radios, televisions. All this technological innovation is happening at once, and mass consumerism is going on in order for people to purchase and buy these new items. And they basically become a staple in the American home. If you guys look at your house, most of you, I'm sure, probably have access to a washing machine and probably a dryer and air conditioning system and heating systems. The same stuff that people in the 1950s are buying in mass. Also, they are starting to buy fashionable clothing. During this time, if you remember what we just talked about, rationing was going on. And so women weren't able to buy high-end fashionable clothing. This changes in the 1950s and into the 60s, where fashion really takes off, and there's, again, people are able to make it with a one-income house. And so there's quite a bit of extra money that's around in order for women to be able to do so. With development of cars, really quickly too, going back really to talk about cars. One thing the car does, aside from giving freedom to American and drive the automotive industry, is it shifts some jobs also. With more cars comes the need to first off sell them, so you have auto dealerships, and then you need somewhere to put gas into them, so you see the rise of the service shop or the gas station. And the service shop also is going to hire people to fix and maintain your car. So a lot of jobs are created with the automotive boom. It's just not a few things here and there. It really drives and pushes the economy forward and puts a lot of people to work. Even today, if you look around, there's a lot of gas stations, there's a lot of service stops, there's a lot of places you can go to buy a car. Look at all the auto dealerships across State Street. I mean, there are hundreds of them. And so as you can see, the automotive industry is still a very big player in the American economy. So now you have these cars and this freedom of movement and travel. You're looking at the American road systems and you're realizing it takes a long time to get through it. Our just standard highways are not interconnected. Our roadways do not kind of link up with each other. Trying to get anywhere is kind of hit or miss travel, where you could end up on a nice paved road and then have to go down a dirt road to get to the next road, which gets you to the next town and city. It's not efficient to move products and services this way. So often most people are relying upon using trains to try to transport goods, offload them, and then try to get them out to more distant towns, and like the suburbs are expanding too. So what do they look at doing? Well, you start to see the expansion of the interstate highway system, and this is built under the Eisenhower administration. And what happens is that there's a large bill that is passed, and this builds freeways across the United States. First off, this puts a lot of people to work. This infrastructure project is probably one of the largest one in United States history. And so it is just in scale and scope unbelievable of how much concrete they're going to lay down and how many roadways and how many junctions they're going to create. So most of the time people aren't aware of when the interstate system starts. This is where it comes from. And this interconnects cities with each other, and it's trying to create a paved road to every major city that there possibly can be. And this allows for improved transportation ability so people can get from place to place in a quick and efficient manner. That's one of the really big goals behind the interstate highway system. And now, because we did it all at once and we really put a lot of time, energy, and investment into it, we still have the largest and most efficient highway system in the entire world. Nobody comes close to it. Trust me, I've been to areas in Latin America, and it is pretty tricky to get from place to place sometimes. You'll find yourself on some fairly sketchy roads on occasion, but that's just the nature of not having an interstate system and putting the time and the investment. Not everybody has the money to be able to do so. So interstate system is very critical to the infrastructure and growth of the American economy. Why? Well, it allows the easy movement of material. And again, we just talked about trains moving products from city to city. And if you drive a train into a city, you have to stop each time. You have to have people unload one train car, 2 train cars, 5 train cars. And once they unload it, then they drive to the next area, the same thing. But then not only did you just unload it, now you have all these products that are just stuck in one area, and you have to move it out by truck or something else like that in order to get it from place to place. Not an efficient system. Now, instead, what we have with the interstate system is the birth and the rise of what we call the truck driver. In fact, they still are, most of our goods and services in this country are moved by semi-trailer. Most people don't realize how impactful and how important American truckers are to the American economy. You now have somebody who could start off and have something manufactured in New York, put it on a truck, and that truck has one delivery spot in the middle of California, and he can get there in 4 days. Comparative to if you have to load it onto a train and it has to make multiple stops throughout the entire country to offload it, you might be 2 to 3 weeks out before you see that product. No longer with trucking. Trucking can go anywhere too. It can go to any town, it can go to any city, and it can be an express one-way trip there. So you no longer have to have these long wait times for your products and services to be moved. And this is why you now have the growth of like grocery stores that come in massive numbers. You can start seeing department stores that are able to be stocked quickly. It's because of this ability for the Americans to move via the interstate system. That is why the interstate system is so important to the American economy. If something was to happen to the American interstate system, it could pretty much bring a lot of the economics to a screeching halt. Um, excuse me. All right, let's talk a little bit more about some elements of transportation. This is going to be our second one. With transportation, we just kind of talked about the interstate system, but we also want to talk about differentiation when it comes to now the growth of the flight industry. With flight, you now have the invention and the incorporation of the jet engine into commercial flying. Before, we were using modified military aircraft that were propeller driven, and they could only hold a small number of passengers. There wasn't a lot of airports for you to travel in and out of, usually through major cities, and not necessarily do you have the range to be able to reach cross country multiple times. Usually you'd have to have one or two stops along the way. Jet engine changes that. Jet engine, a lot more power. If you develop it correctly, you can have a pretty good fuel economy if you fly at certain altitudes anyways. And this allows more and more people to be able to travel by plane because the planes are larger. The larger the plane is, the more seats you can put onto it, and the cheaper you can charge for those seats. This also then drives the innovation and the advent of building more airports and connecting more cities. And once people find out how fast they can fly from place to place, more people start to use the airline industry in order to travel and to go on vacations. People are now, of course, they're moving via the interstate system and now through the skies. And this changes, again, the dynamics of how Americans move. Americans have greater semblance of freedoms, ideas, and also when you look at airline flight, one of the things that really changes is business. People are now able to quickly make business deals by being able to fly across the country in 10 hours, sometimes less than that, sometimes 6. And so you could be in New York and you could fly out to a California supplier and you could have a face-to-face meeting with them, make an agreement, and set up trucking routes. That is all these different elements come together to really drive the American economy. Let's talk quickly about equipment and tools, of how they change too. Farming becomes has a lot more automation now, a lot more machines that can do the work of 5 men in one. And you see the decline in the number of farmers in the United States during this time frame. In fact, in America today, because of farming technology, only 3% of the American population works in farming. However, they produce virtually all of our food. But they do so because of technological innovation in farming. And a lot of this technology comes starting in the 1950s, where we start to see the farmers now being pushed out and into the cities doing factory work and other things. But the farming just makes it more efficient, allows us to produce more food, and this allows then more people to live a more comfortable lifestyle. Also, other things that change too during this time frame is electricity now reaches virtually every single American home. So this now ability to have electricity then brings more machines into a person's house. Remember, we talked about at the beginning, consumerism is on the rise. You need electricity to power most of these new fancy inventions of the era. So electricity drives the improvement of equipment that people would be using in their everyday lives. Another thing though that starts to play a role in how companies and businesses work is the computer. Now, early computers were very large. Sometimes they'd have to take up entire floors of office buildings to be able to do simple computations and calculations. But with using the computer, it allows automation to start taking hold in a lot of different areas. One of the cool ones to look at is the phone industry. If you watch old movies or old TV shows, I'm a big fan of old movies. If you guys haven't noticed by me talking about old movies all the time. I really like old movies though. But you'll see people call in and then a lady will get on the line. She'll be like, "Hey, operator." And they'll be like, "Hey, I want to call 4321." And so she would take it and she'd move one cord from one place and put it into another place on a switchboard. And that's how you used to make your phone calls. With computers, that automates the phone system, so you no longer have to call an operator into it, and it just automatically moves it throughout the country. This allows for greater access to phone systems so you can talk with more people across the country. So computers play a very important role in the American economy going forward. So make sure you realize that computers do play a role in this. What about American natural resources? Well, we've talked about natural resources before, but one thing to understand is that the United States has vast amounts of natural resources. We are basically, if we ever needed to or wanted to, we could disconnect from most of the rest of the world, and we could just maintain our level of economic activity with what we have in the United States. So anytime a business needed access to resources, they have immediate access to it. And if not, they have efficient means and systems in place to be able to move resources quickly in place. One of the things that we look for is that with the increased economy and with more cars on the road and more things made out of plastics, we need access to oil. Down in Texas, there's huge reserves of oil down there. However, the demand becomes so great that America decides, instead of using its own personal oil resources, it'll start to bring in oil from the Middle East. Now it preserves American oil, but at the same time, this is going to create future conflicts in the Middle East. And it's going to drive America to wage war or intervene in multiple governments in the Middle East because of this desired access to oil. Oil is going to play a critical role in the 20th century when we start looking at international conflicts. It plays a role even into the 21st century when we look at things. All right, labor. Let's talk quickly about labor. When the war engine closes out of the United States, it looks like there's going to be lots of factory closures. Suddenly you have 12 million men coming off of military duty that are no longer needed. Well, what happens with all those men? Well, again, they have a lot of money, extra money lying around. So quickly the companies that were developing war machines converted over and started making cars, started making washing machines, started making jet planes. They start to change over just what they do, and they give millions of jobs to these people who just came back from overseas. So people are not out of work for very long once they come back again. Not only that, you see the rise of the blue-collared worker. Blue-collared workers are typically people that work like in, say, the service industry, not the service industry, excuse me, in like service shops, like mechanic shops, or also works in factories. So the blue-collar jobs are paying really well for Americans during this time frame. In fact, again, this allows an easy, good middle-class lifestyle because of these blue-collar jobs. Americans are doing very well with it. Another thing, though, that comes about is the United States government establishes what is known as the GI Bill, or the Montgomery GI Bill. The GI Bill gives all sorts of benefits to the American returning servicemen. One of the very first things it does is it gives housing allowances. It helps them buy houses by giving them guaranteed home loans. Another thing that it does is it gives them access to education, higher education. So this allows a lot of people to go to school and improve their knowledge set so that they can get hired into higher paying jobs. Not only that, is that it then gives preferential hiring to American military veterans in certain jobs. So if you'd served in the military and you use your Montgomery GI Bill and you got a good education, you show up at a place that has a good paying job, guess what? You get preferential treatment first and foremost to be able to get that job. So we really take care of our veterans right after World War II in this sense. Admittedly, though, when we look at people right problems, which we frequently do, African Americans are frequently left out of these programs. So they're not giving the same rights and privileges as white returning soldiers. With the labor front, though, we're also going to look at with unions. So unions, they do not strike during World War II in order to preserve the ability for the American war machine to produce means and material to fight the war. Wouldn't look very good if you got guys fighting on the front line not being able to get the materials and the war machines they would want because somebody goes on strike. However, once they get back, they start demanding higher pay. They want better benefits. And so they start making demands again. The United States government in return responds with, first off, we're going to pass the Taft-Hartley Act. With that, that creates a right to work system. Utah is a right to work state, one thing to understand. But with the right to work system, it just basically means if you show up at a job that's unionized, you do not have to join a union. You are not required by law, or you're not forced into joining a union if you do not want to. And this infuriates the union because often that's how they protected their jobs and they got how their unions ran. They would be able to collect union fees. So if people could opt out of that, then they would lose money and resources. But at the same time, they felt like these people were not adding to the benefits and being able to improve the standing of the union. So key point to remember though, right to work states or right to work processes by not joining a union. All right, money and credit, that's another one of our factors. Money and credit was widely available. First off, we talked about the savings of Americans coming off of World War II. They have a lot of money, the ability to spend that money, so they do. They spend a lot of it. But also, you see again, like in the 1920s, you see the rise of credit. However, you do not create a giant credit balloon that implodes and drops the entire economy. Instead, people are put on installment plans that they could pay because they have good paying jobs. And so you see these installment plans happen on everything from washers and dryers to cars. So lots of people buy these consumer goods on these installment plans and they make their payments, and now they have all the kind of Western luxuries that we are used to also during this time frame. And going back to kind of reiterate this point, one of the best ways to gain wealth in the United States still to this day is buying a home. And the Montgomery GI Bill guarantees home loans to those returning GIs. That's why you see the explosion of housing. It's because all these men have now the ability to be able to buy a home for the first time. Let's quickly end here. We're going to talk about profit. Now, during this time, companies see massive profits, especially the automotive industry. They make money hand over fist during this time frame. So when you look at just sheer numbers, before the war, corporations were making about $10 billion. After the war, they're making $27 billion. It's almost 3 times as much. I mean, you're talking a huge growth in economic activity in the United States. And so this allows them to pay more to their workers, allows them to invest into more companies and more innovation. So you see companies really come out ahead during the post-war years. They also continue to grow and expand. And one of the ways that they expand is by going and becoming what's known as diversified. Diversification basically means that a company is going out and buying smaller companies and bringing them underneath an umbrella of a larger company. If you were to look at it today, you could look at like a Procter & Gamble, where they have numerous smaller groups underneath them, but they are themselves a massive corporations that own smaller companies. And some of the products and services you buy, you may not even realize that you're buying it under one of those umbrella companies. But that's what you really see, one of the driving forces here, though, is that people are buying up smaller companies. And they're using it because then they can provide more products and services to more consumers and make higher profits. So diversification is a very critical thing that companies start to do that really start to drive profits during this time frame. All right, guys. Well, that covers the 7 factors for the American economy during the post-war era. We are going to go ahead and continue on tomorrow. We're going to talk a little bit more this time about social and political type activities during the 1945 to 1960 time frame. Make sure you guys go on and do the quiz. I've made things a little bit easier. We are now just doing 1 quiz a day, no more homework on top of that. The quiz will be about 5 questions, and it'll be what we covered on our PowerPoints and what's been said in this presentation. All right, guys, I will see you tomorrow.